The way to proceed to a scientific theory is by way of hypothesis, conjecture. We guess what might be the case using intuition, a Ouija board. It really doesn't matter. We guess what might be the case, and then we deduce from that as a given what else we might expect to see. And if we can't directly test for the original hypothesis, we can test whether the remainder of the facts available conform with that original hypothesis. If in any given question we refrain from putting forward a hypothesis, then we can't take inferential steps to arrive at other trains of investigation which might lead to a broader theory. When you stop making hypotheses, you're not engaged in scientific inquiry. If you want to know the nature of the world, you have to generate a hypothesis. Imagine you and your friend are detectives and you walk into a murder scene. There's a dead body sprawled across the floor. Blood spattered on the wall. And you say that the back of the person's head looks bashed in. You say, I think this was homicide by blunt force trauma. And let's see, this piano bench here is missing a leg. This is consistent with the patterns we observe. I think this was probably a domestic dispute. Someone smashed the piano leg. Maybe it was during a piano lesson. And, did this person in. And your partner says, well, I don't see the piano leg anywhere. So we really don't have the evidence to support that hypothesis. What are you going to ask them? You're going to ask, okay, so what's your hypothesis? If that other detective doesn't have a hypothesis, what are you going to do? You're going to go with the original hypothesis put forward by the first detective. You can't proceed in science or philosophy unless you have some kind of answer to a question. Now, whether a question is worth investigating or not is a question of where we want to invest our resources. But that's really an ethical question. And the idea that there is a right answer to where we want to invest our resources presupposes some kind of ethical theory. And an ethical theory will have to be informed by other hypotheses about the world, other elements of our theory like our metaphysics, our cosmology, our psychology. All of that informs the kind of ethical call we'll make regarding the necessity or value of engaging in any kind of hypothetical investigation. So I recently had a debate with JF on the topic of idealism and physicalism. And I started by saying that my epistemological method is that for any given question, we have to evaluate between the available hypotheses on the basis of whatever evidence or information we have available. I elaborated that this is taking off from Quine's holism and also the Kuhnian notion of a scientific paradigm. There are always all sorts of auxiliary hypotheses in the background of any evaluation. And so what constitutes evidence will itself be informed by the theoretical presuppositions we have. And so when I say any information available, this could be from divine revelation in Scripture, hypothetically, depending on your theoretical priors. And so when we evaluate between these hypotheses, we can't a priori rule out any sort of evidence. Instead, given the sorts of evidence that are admitted by a theory, we evaluate that theory on its internal consistency, on its parsimony overall, on its explanatory power, all as against those other theories which are in fact available, not in isolation. You don't solve the murder by arriving with apodeictic certainty at a guess as to what happened. You come up with your best theory and you evaluate that best theory against any other competing theory. The best theory wins. There's no use in saying, well, we don't have enough evidence yet, let's not speculate. No, because taking the speculative leap and coming up with a hypothesis then gives you the available inferential steps to look for new pieces of information that you might not have looked for otherwise. The murder scene. If the other person said, you know what, actually, this looks like a frame job. I notice an empty vial over here, and I smell this, and it smells like this particular compound that is highly toxic. And the nearest lab where someone could have gotten this compound is 6 miles down the road. Here, let's go check it out. Maybe the culprit is still there. And so making this speculative leap and coming up with a hypothesis gives you clues as to where to look for new information. So waiting, saying we don't have strong enough evidence, let's sit where we are at some kind of null hypothesis or like a starting position of no position, that's not as useful as going ahead and taking some kind of leap and saying, this might be the way it is. Let's investigate this. So that's like the epistemological position that I put forward. And JF did concede the central point in saying that physicalism leaves open the question of what physical systems actually are. Right now, they seem to be quantum fields. Of course, we only know quantum fields by our mathematical descriptions and our conceptualizations. And so we know how we represent them to ourselves. We don't know what they actually are beyond that representation. So we don't really have an answer of what the thing is in itself. And for JF, that's okay. We don't have to answer that question. But that is the fundamental question of idealism versus physicalism. Physicalism says basically only that whatever it is, it's not the mind. We don't know what it is yet. And really there's no clear path at arriving at an answer for this metaphysical question of the essence of physical systems in themselves. How could you even describe something as it is in itself without going through the mediation of your own representation in the first place? So the physicalist has no path forward and nothing to suggest as the nature of matter. Now, what JF did consistently, and I should have called him out on this, but I try to argue in good faith and with a congenial spirit when possible. And so I didn't, I don't know, maybe my attitude is not that of a competitive debater. I really like having arguments and arriving at the truth if possible, but what he did consistently was conflate physicalism as a metaphysical position, which it is. Physicalism is a metaphysical position, a form of metaphysical skepticism, dogmatic metaphysical skepticism, and he conflated that with science. And it's not the same. Science is different from physicalism. When I say physicalism is promissory, it's the idea that maybe one day we'll know what physical systems are in themselves. Right now we don't have an answer. Or our best guess is something like quantum fields, whatever quantum fields are pointing to in reality. And that is promissory in the sense that there's no answer yet, there's no hypothesis yet about what a quantum field is in itself beyond our representation. And he takes that and spins it into, science is only making promises. No, science has delivered. Well, yes, science has delivered, but you can have metaphysical idealism and the scientific method as it exists. I thought that JF would come in with more of good faith, a good faith attitude, but when he reviewed my video Physicalism is Vacuous on his stream, he heard me make these points, as in idealism, some variety of panpsychism, for example, can replicate all of the methodological rigor of science based on a metaphysical materialism or physicalism. The metaphysics does not impact physics as far as all existing accepted physics. The metaphysics allows you to expand on the physics, but it doesn't detract anything. It adds something, but the metaphysical speculation doesn't take away what we know in practical terms in theoretical science, theoretical physics as it exists, and for every other branch of science. The metaphysics of physicalism doesn't add anything. It's not substantial to the accomplishment of science. And most of the founders of modern science were not materialists. Newton himself was not a materialist. The founders of quantum theory were not materialists. Most of them were mystics. Newton was a mystic. And the meaning of a mystic is not commonly understood, but it's different than someone who believes in superstitious things. But, so yeah, that conflation, I don't know, I don't think it betrays just a lack of understanding. I think it's a kind of sophistical device intended to direct attention away from this central question. But it is a question of significant moment, considering that the elites have pushed the philosophy of physicalism against idealism from the days of, strongly since the days of, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name, the Principia Mathematica, Whitehead, and yeah, this is sad. I mean, Bertrand Russell. Wow, that's quite the name to blank on. But since the days of Bertrand Russell, materialism, physicalism, these usually British advocates of this scientistic philosophy, which is now mainstream, which is assumed to be just naturally the way it is, they've used these sophistical devices, just not really addressing the core philosophical issue at hand, pointing out that it is a metaphysical position and it's different from what science does methodologically and what it allows us in terms of knowledge about phenomena. The elites have used this kind of materialism, and you can see why they would have an interest in doing so if they want to reduce populations and create more malleable people. Because religion increases people's birth rates, and it gives them some form of identity which is separate from the state. It gives them some kind of groundedness, and to deracinate people, you have to strip that away. And materialism is one attempt at stripping away the kind of spiritualism that naturally, usually accompanies idealism. Idealism itself, as a strict metaphysical position, does not necessarily involve any kind of religious view. Like Schopenhauer was technically an atheist and didn't believe in any obvious spiritual view, but he formulated a system of ethics. And so in order to avoid the expansion of some kind of well-grounded spiritual elaboration of Christianity or any other form of religion, the elites have pushed instead materialism, and when they push spiritualism, as they sometimes do, it's in this kind of woo-woo, insane variety with a bunch of different cults available, Wicca or Satanism, and they're all toxic in one way or another. And so the spiritual domain is stripped of philosophical rigor at a popular level, and that I include Protestantism for the most part in that as well, just as bad as the New Age usually in terms of philosophical foundations. And that's not a universal statement. Obviously, there are great Protestant theologians as well. And then on the philosophical side, they obscure the metaphysical question entirely. Most people don't understand what metaphysics even means. The question of essence, the question of what things are in themselves. this has been obscured because I can see how that conduces to the interest of the elite. So why should we question this? Why should we invest energy in this hypothesis of the nature of what reality is in itself? Because if we're looking for a well-grounded ethic, and it turns out that idealism is true, then the idea that physical systems have some kind of inherent sense of good and bad, if there is teleology in some fashion in nature, then we would want to tease that out. And we shouldn't a priori rule it out because it's not consistent with physicalism. Because again, physicalism is not even well defined. It's a vacuum. What is a physical system? Oh, well, that's open and it's whatever the math points to. But it's a flat denial to engage in the metaphysical question. It's not a metaphysical hypothesis. It's a metaphysical vacuum. So the practical reason for even bothering with the question is that the elites have used physicalism to suppress birth rates in Western countries and erode the moral foundations and cultural foundations that allow these people to have some degree of autonomy from the machinations of the technocratic state. So there's a real political reason to at least look at the question. And then at a strictly philosophical level, now that you think there may be some reason to look into the metaphysical question, at a strictly philosophical level, if you think that making a hypothesis is better than not making a hypothesis, on that basis alone, idealism is superior to the kind of physicalism articulated by JF, which is a physicalism that is a metaphysical vacuum. So I noticed a lot of comments saying, why would we want a more complete system? What does it matter if you offer an explanation if we don't really know it's true? Well, that ignores the epistemological argument, which I went to some length to try to make clear. But I know that a lot of these notions are very foreign to people, and it's not easy to understand, especially on the basis of an hour-long debate. And I'm not always the clearest expositor of some of these philosophical notions. I've referenced the people that I think you ought to read: Schopenhauer, Kastrup. Look at some of Johann Ratz's stuff. There are others out there, but so I understand people not understanding it, but if you take the epistemological view seriously, that you have to pick the best hypothesis, then idealism is a hypothesis. And the completion, the more robust nature of the system, the larger nature of the system, answering more questions, is additional explanatory power. And on that basis, it has some kind of advantage as against a system which does not have that same level of robustness or completion. So a more complete system is necessarily better than a less complete system, ceteris paribus. So I know that the people who would disagree with the points I'm making now probably aren't watching this. They probably watched the debate and then went back to JF's channel. Part of it is also a psychological issue where JF thinks that he's somewhere on the autism spectrum, and so does Kurt Doolittle. Not that Kurt thinks that JF is, but Kurt thinks that he is. And neither of them are capable of thinking about metaphysics at all. And I've gotten into it with Kurt, and he just hits a wall where he can't conceptualize the question properly of what is meant by a thing in itself. And I think it's because autism is object-oriented and mechanism-oriented, and it's the model-train mentality, and going beyond the model is just unthinkable. Everything exists within the model, and physicalism is the idea that we can work with the model, but what underlies the model, that's not safe. Let's just keep on building our model trains and see if we get anywhere with that. But I'm sorry, autism is not a superior state of consciousness. It's a different one that has some advantages, but it's not complete, and it's missing some aspects of the human condition that we need to factor in if we're going to recover our civilization and put ourselves on a good footing for the next century, which will be a bloody and harsh and cruel century in a lot of ways. And what's the usefulness of idealism? If it allows a scientific grounding, and there are testable things that we could go into with the kind of idealist model that I'm supporting. And I'll go into that in the future. I've gone into some of it in the past. I'll get more scientific with it in the future, as more data is coming out in support of these notions. And you'll see, and I'm not the only person talking about this stuff. I'm not making it up myself. But anyway, there are things that we can test. If we can provide a scientific grounding for ethics, for notions of consciousness beyond human consciousness, the possibilities of consciousness, if we can explain parapsychological phenomena, and there is data to explain. You can explain it away by saying it's all bunk, but you can't really prove that. And new data continues to come out in that field, and it can't be dismissed with a hand wave. That's bad science. I mean, even if something doesn't conform with your current theories, evidence doesn't conform, that doesn't give you a justification to hand wave away that evidence. So I think idealism could provide a foundation for morals, could provide a foundation for belief in afterlife, like all of these things that religion tries to do through these more primitive cognitive modalities. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense at all, but we could address those things at a scientific, clear, conscious level in an empirical way. And that would be a major boon to people who are suffering from a lack of meaning, a lack of a sense of a purpose in life, who are given this metaphysical vacuum, and they're told that they live in a one big bang which will disintegrate into nothing in the end. Nothing ultimately matters. It's just particles bumping into each other. There's no meaning in nature, and you don't know any of that. It's a pure assumption, and it's an assumption founded on a lack of a hypothesis, because there's nothing positive in the physicalist view. It's just saying it's not idealism. And the most serious philosophers are generally idealists going through history. I think that people who have written this view off, feel free to debate me on this. I am always willing to debate this topic and willing to talk to people generally. But it was a little bit disappointing seeing the kinds of moves that JF made in that debate. He was appealing directly to the audience and not trying to have a conversation with me. And I did frame it as a debate, which is perhaps my bad. What I really meant was, let's have the argument and arrive at the truth. And I approached it with that mentality. But, let me know what you think about these points. And yeah, I'll definitely touch on all this stuff in the future. Thanks for listening.